Carl Jung once wrote, "The greatest burden a man can bear is to become who he truly is, and yet, this burden is also the only path to real freedom." At first, these words sound poetic, almost comforting, but if you sit with them long enough, they begin to sting. Because what Jung was pointing to was not a simple idea of self-discovery, not the shallow advice to just follow your heart or chase your dreams. He was pointing at something much deeper, something terrifying, the truth that most of us live as strangers to ourselves. For Jung, the human mind was not just what we see on the surface. Beneath our daily personality lives a vast underworld, a realm of forgotten memories, rejected traits, and unlived potential. This is what he called the shadow. And he believed that until we face this hidden part of ourselves, we are not free, we are trapped. Not trapped by society or politics or circumstance, but by our own refusal to see who we really are. The shadow does not disappear just because we ignore it. It acts in secret, shaping our decisions, pushing us into patterns, making us repeat the same mistakes over and over. And the most dangerous part is that we believe it is fate, when in reality, it is simply ourselves acting from the dark. Jung gave countless examples of how this plays out. A man who prides himself on being rational may secretly despise his own vulnerability, so he projects it onto others, calling them weak. A woman who longs for freedom may deny her desire, only to find herself drawn again and again to controlling partners. Societies too carry shadows. Nations that proclaim themselves peaceful may wage hidden wars. Cultures that speak of morality may harbor cruelty in silence. Until we know the shadow, we act as its servants without realizing it. But there is something even more unsettling. Jung did not say that confronting the shadow would make life easier. On the contrary, he warned that it is one of the most painful tasks a human being can undertake. To face the shadow is to admit that we are not who we thought we were. That the polished mask we show to the world is only a fragment of our being. The other side is raw, uncomfortable, and even shameful. We see in ourselves traits we despise in others. We encounter impulses we swore we would never have. And in that moment, we are tempted to run. Many do. They retreat back into the safety of distraction, into the comfort of blaming others, into the illusion of their carefully curated personality. Yet Jung insisted that this confrontation is the doorway to freedom. Because when we integrate the shadow, something changes. We no longer live in fear of being exposed, because we have already exposed ourselves to ourselves. We no longer project our unknown flaws onto others, because we have owned them. We no longer live half-lives, because we have made peace with the parts we once rejected. To know the shadow is to become whole. And wholeness, not perfection, is what Jung believed to be the deepest form of liberation. He once observed that people would rather cling to chains than face their inner truth. They would rather suffer familiar pain than enter the unknown. But he believed that every real act of healing, whether in an individual or in a culture, begins with this frightening honesty. Without it, we live as prisoners of our unconscious. With it, we begin the slow and painful process of becoming free. This is why Jung's work is so haunting. He does not offer us quick hope. He does not promise that everything will be fine if we just think positively, or repeat affirmations. He warns us instead that we carry an entire hidden world inside, and that world will either rule us in secret, or we will learn to know it. Freedom, in Jung's sense, is not given, it is wrestled for, through years of self-examination, through courage to face what we would rather not see, through the willingness to admit we are far larger, far darker, and far more complicated than we pretend to be. The shadow is not the enemy, it is part of us. To reject it completely is to remain incomplete. To embrace it blindly is to be consumed. But to recognize it, to bring it into the light, to give it a place without letting it dominate, that, Jung believed, is the beginning of real freedom. And so, the journey to freedom is not outwards but inwards. It does not begin in the world outside, but in the silence where we finally face ourselves. most will never take this path. But for those who do, Jung believed they touch something eternal, the possibility of becoming a whole human being. Carl Jung often warned that the greatest danger for modern man was not the loss of tradition, not the collapse of religion, not even the pressures of war or economics, but the quiet and unnoticed domination of the unconscious. The unseen hand that guides our lives when we refuse to know ourselves. He believed that every person who avoids this confrontation with the self eventually becomes a victim of it. Their unlived life builds in the shadows, and one day, it bursts through in ways they cannot control. This is why Jung spoke of neurosis not as a meaningless illness, but as a signal, a cry from the depths, a call to turn inward. He saw symptoms like anxiety, compulsions, and depression, not merely as disorders to suppress, but as messages from the psyche, urging us to listen, urging us to see what we have ignored. For Jung, every breakdown carried within it the possibility of breakthrough, but only if the individual was willing to ask what the suffering was pointing toward. He believed that the human being was not born finished, but unfinished. Our task is not to conform to an ideal image imposed from the outside, but to slowly unfold the unique pattern within us. This process he called individuation, the journey of becoming whole. And he warned that no one escapes this demand. If we resist it, life itself has a way of forcing the confrontation, through failures, betrayals, losses, and crises that strip away our masks. In those moments, we are given a choice: retreat into denial, or accept the painful work of transformation. Individuation is not about becoming perfect, nor is it about chasing constant happiness. Jung saw happiness as a byproduct, not a goal. For him, the goal was wholeness, to reconcile the opposites within us, light and dark, strength and vulnerability, reason and instinct. To integrate the fragments we have split apart, and to stand firmly in the truth of our own complexity. Only then, he believed, can a person live without being torn apart by inner conflict. But individuation comes with a price. It often isolates us, because few around us are willing to walk the same path. Jung knew that the one who takes their inner life seriously often feels alienated from the collective, because the collective thrives on conformity. The collective prefers the mask, the persona, the role we play in society, while individuation demands that we step beyond the mask and claim a deeper truth. Jung was clear: the persona is not evil. It is necessary. It allows us to function in the world, to speak in public, to work, to play our roles as friend, parent, partner. But the danger comes when we mistake the mask for the whole of ourselves. When we cling so tightly to our persona that we suffocate the living self beneath it. This is why so many people feel an emptiness even in success. They have polished the mask, but neglected the soul. And the soul does not remain silent. It speaks through dreams, through sudden fears, through longings that seem irrational. It whispers in moments when the world grows quiet, reminding us of what we have hidden. Jung devoted much of his work to dreams, not because he saw them as random, but because he believed they were the language of the unconscious, symbols pointing us toward the parts of ourselves we have lost. A recurring figure, a strange animal, a forgotten place, all of these he saw as pieces of the psyche trying to return to consciousness. This is why he urged people to listen to their dreams, not to interpret them with rigid formulas, but to enter into dialogue with them, to see them as guides from within. Because if we ignore them, if we silence the voice of the unconscious, it does not vanish, it rebels. It erupts in obsessions, in destructive choices, in patterns we cannot explain. In this way, the very freedom we claim to have in modern life becomes an illusion. We think we are free, but we are moved like puppets by the forces we refuse to face. For Jung, true freedom is not the absence of limits. It is the conscious acceptance of who we are, limits and all. It is not living without struggle, but living with awareness of the struggle. To be free is not to escape the unconscious, but to live in dialogue with it, to let it speak, to let it shape us without letting it control us in secret. He often reminded his patients that the path of individuation is not a straight line. It is a spiral. We return to the same wounds again and again, each time with a little more understanding, a little more strength. We confront the shadow not once, but many times. Each return deepens us. Each return makes us more whole. And Jung knew that this work cannot be done only for ourselves. Because as long as individuals remain strangers to themselves, societies remain trapped in collective shadows. Whole nations act out what individuals refuse to face. Wars erupt where anger is denied. Oppression grows where fear is hidden. Cruelty emerges where weakness is despised. To heal the world, Jung believed, begins with healing the self. And so, when he warned that we are not free until we know ourselves, he was not speaking of some abstract idea. He was describing the most urgent truth of human existence. We may build wealth, careers, reputations, but if we do not know the forces moving in the depths of our own soul, we are not free. We are only actors in a play we do not understand. Jung believed that the deepest roots of our imprisonment do not lie only in the personal shadow, but in something far vaster, the collective unconscious. Within every individual psyche, he argued, lives an ancient inheritance, patterns of thought and feeling that have shaped humanity for millennia. These patterns are not learned, they are given. They are what he called archetypes, the timeless images that live in myths, in stories, in religions, in art, and in the very structure of our imagination. Archetypes are not fantasies we invent. They are the deep grammar of the soul, recurring figures like the hero, the mother, the wise old man, the trickster, the child. They appear in the dreams of a modern person just as they appeared in the myths of ancient cultures. And for Jung, they showed that the unconscious is not only personal, but shared. It binds us to all who have come before. But here is the paradox. While archetypes can guide us, they can also possess us. When we remain unconscious of them, we are swept up in their force without knowing it. A man may believe he is freely pursuing greatness, yet in truth he has been consumed by the archetype of the hero, sacrificing everything to live out a story larger than his own individuality. A woman may be caught in the mother archetype so deeply that her entire being is absorbed in nurturing others, while her own soul goes unfed. A society may fall under the spell of the warrior archetype, glorifying violence as destiny, while blind to the devastation it causes. For Jung, freedom meant not escaping the archetypes, for that is impossible, but entering into conscious relationship with them, to recognize their pull, to learn from them, to honor them without being devoured by them. He saw myths not as dead tales of the past, but as living expressions of the psyche. And he warned that when modern man dismisses myth as superstition, he does not become rational and free, he becomes more vulnerable than ever. Because the archetypes do not vanish, they move in the dark, they erupt in politics, in mass movements, in fanaticism that grips entire cultures. This is why Jung studied not only individuals, but also history. He saw how the collective unconscious surged through nations, shaping wars and revolutions. He watched how symbols could awaken hidden energies in millions of people. And he feared the power of collective possession, when a society forgets the individual soul, and becomes ruled by an archetype acting unconsciously. In those times, people believe they are free, but they are swept along by forces far older than themselves. Yet Jung also saw the healing side of archetypes. He saw how myths and symbols could give meaning to suffering, how rituals could help the individual psyche move through loss, how stories could awaken the courage to endure the darkest nights. He believed that without myth, the modern person is spiritually starved. We may have technology, we may have progress, but we lose the language of the soul. And without that language, we lose the path to wholeness. In his later writings, Jung emphasized that freedom is not found by rejecting the old myths, but by seeing through them, by recognizing their presence within us, and by living them consciously rather than unconsciously. To walk with myth is to walk with companions as old as humanity itself, companions that guide us through love, death, transformation, and rebirth. For him, the task of individuation was inseparable from this mythic dimension. Because to become whole is not only to reconcile our personal shadow, but also to awaken to the archetypal life within. It is to see that our suffering is not random, but part of a story the psyche has always told. It is to recognize that our longings, our dreams, our fears, echo patterns that humanity has carried for thousands of years. This recognition is not meant to bind us tighter, but to free us. To see that we are not isolated fragments, drifting alone in time, but participants in a vast drama of the soul. When we live this way, we begin to understand what Jung meant by the deeper freedom, a freedom that does not deny our bonds, but accepts them consciously. And perhaps most importantly, he believed that myth is the bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. It gives us images to hold what cannot be explained by reason alone. It allows us to speak with the depths in a language the depths can understand. Without myth, the unconscious erupts chaotically. With myth, it can be woven into meaning. And so, Jung's vision of freedom was never the narrow idea of doing as one pleases. It was a freedom born of dialogue with the unconscious, both personal and collective. It was freedom rooted in myth, in symbols, in the eternal archetypes that live within us. For Jung, the shadow was the doorway, the archetypes were the language, but beyond both, he spoke of something even greater, the self. Not the self in the everyday sense of identity, not the ego that says I am this person with this name and this history, but the self with a capital S, the mysterious center of the psyche that holds together all opposites. The ego is small, fragile, easily threatened. It clings to certainty, it builds defenses, it hides from what it cannot control. But the self is vast. It is not only conscious or unconscious, but both. It is the totality of who we are, known and unknown. It is the hidden pattern of our being, the deeper order beneath the surface of chaos. Jung sometimes spoke of it as an inner God image, not a God in the external sense, but the experience of wholeness that has always been symbolized as divine. For him, the true goal of individuation was not to strengthen the ego alone, but to align the ego with the self. To let the small I recognize that it is held within a larger whole. This alignment does not erase the ego. It gives it its proper place. The ego becomes a servant rather than a tyrant, a vessel rather than a master. And in that shift, freedom is born. Because the ego is enslaved by fear and desire, but the self is not. Jung often pointed out that when people experience profound transformation, they feel as if something greater than themselves is guiding the process. They dream of mandalas, of circles and centers, of radiant symbols of unity. They speak of being carried, as though an intelligence within is leading them toward balance. For Jung, these were signs of the self, trying to bring the psyche into wholeness. But the path to the self is not peaceful. It is marked by tension, because the self contains opposites, light and dark, masculine and feminine, order and chaos. The ego wants one side, safety, clarity, simplicity. But the self demands that we hold both, to suffer the conflict without collapsing into one extreme. To endure the tension until a new synthesis emerges. Jung called this the transcendent function, the mysterious way the psyche produces something new when opposites are consciously held together. This is why freedom in Jung's sense is not comfort. It is not the escape from struggle. It is the ability to stand in the center of tension, without running to one side or the other. The freedom to live with complexity, to endure ambiguity, to accept that we are never finished, always becoming. For Jung, this was the deepest maturity. And he saw symbols as guides toward this wholeness. The mandala, with its center and its balance of parts, was for him the image of the self. It appeared in dreams across cultures, circles within circles, squares within circles, radiant centers, always pointing toward integration. To contemplate such symbols was not superstition, but participation in the psyche's own striving for unity. Jung himself experienced this directly. In his Red Book, he recorded visions that arose during his confrontation with the unconscious. He painted mandalas that seemed to form spontaneously, as if the self itself was revealing its pattern to him. He wrote of dialogues with figures that personified aspects of his soul. Through this long and painful descent, he realized that the psyche was not chaos, but an ordered whole, and that at its center lay the self. But he warned, the self is not a possession. It is not something the ego can claim as its achievement. It is more like a presence, a guiding center we can approach, but never fully grasp. To mistake the ego for the self is the greatest danger. It leads to inflation, the belief that one is godlike, that one has transcended the human struggle. Jung saw this in prophets, in gurus, in dictators who believed themselves infallible. To truly serve the self is to remain humble, to recognize that we are instruments of a greater wholeness, not its masters. And so, freedom for Jung was not liberation from responsibility, but alignment with a deeper responsibility, to live in harmony with the self, to serve the unfolding of wholeness both in ourselves and in the world around us. He believed that when a person achieves even a glimpse of this alignment, their life changes. They feel guided not by fear or ambition, but by a quiet necessity, a sense of meaning that is not imposed from outside, but rises from within. This is why he said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Because to live from the self is to live a life that is uniquely yours, not borrowed from others, not dictated by convention, but flowing from the deep pattern that belongs only to you. It is freedom not in the shallow sense of doing whatever you wish, but in the profound sense of becoming what you were meant to be. Jung's vision always returned to one truth, that the fate of the individual and the fate of humanity cannot be separated. He warned again and again that the horrors of the 20th century, the wars, the cruelty, the mass movements that swallowed millions, were not accidents of history. They were eruptions of the collective unconscious, shadows denied on a massive scale, archetypes breaking loose without awareness, entire societies possessed by forces they could not name. He saw clearly that what each person refuses to face within themselves does not simply vanish. It seeps into the culture. It becomes projection, scapegoating, violence against the other. What is denied in the heart of one man is acted out in the destiny of nations. And so he believed that the work of knowing oneself is not a private luxury, but a moral duty. Because the world we build will always mirror the souls we refuse to face. The shadow, the archetypes, the self, these were not abstract theories for Jung. They were living realities, pressing upon every life. He knew that when we deny the shadow, it owns us. When we ignore the archetypes, they swallow us. When we mistake the ego for the self, we destroy ourselves and those around us. But he also knew that when we confront the shadow with honesty, when we recognize the archetypes with awareness, when we align with the self with humility, then we find a freedom that no external power can take away. That freedom is not the freedom of endless choice, not the restless pursuit of pleasure, but the freedom of meaning, the freedom of being whole, the freedom of living a life that belongs entirely to itself. To live this way is to walk a narrow path, often lonely, often misunderstood. But for Jung, it was the only path that truly leads forward. He once wrote that the world hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man. He knew that technology could advance, economies could grow, empires could rise and fall, but none of it mattered if the human soul remained unconscious. If men and women continued to live as strangers to themselves, the same cycles of destruction would repeat. But if even a few individuals dared to take the inner journey, to face what most run from, then something could shift. Because each whole human being radiates wholeness outward. Their freedom becomes a light, showing others what is possible. In this way, Jung saw every person's inner work as a contribution to humanity. not in grand gestures, not in revolutions or manifestos, but in the quiet courage to live truthfully, to confront the darkness within, to carry the tension of opposites, to serve the self rather than the mask. That work, invisible as it may seem, creates ripples through families, communities, cultures. It heals not only the individual, but the fabric of the collective soul. And so, when Jung said, "You will never be free until you know this," he meant that freedom is not outside of you. It is not given by governments, by wealth, or by circumstance. It lies in the hidden depths of your own being, in the shadow you fear, in the myths you carry, in the self that waits in silence. To ignore it is to remain bound. To face it is to begin to live. The path is difficult. It demands honesty, humility, and patience. But Jung believed that nothing else in life could compare. Because in the end, freedom is not what you possess, but who you become.